So, another easy question. Who is the worst president in American history? And the reason I'm asking that is because I've seen in the discourse a lot, and both sides do this, is that there tends to be a sort of like norm that people describe either Biden or Trump as the worst presidents ever. If you're right wing, people like Trump in particular calling Joe Biden the worst president in American history. And then, of course, there's this like left wing, like sort of like academic approach where people are like, okay, here are the reasons why I think that Trump is the worst president ever. And I feel like both of those opinions are like extremely based in recency bias, and people aren't really taking the time to appreciate just how terrible American presidents have been. In fact, there's like an era or like a chunk of presidents that I refer to personally as the not great eight, which is very uncreative, but please feel free to use it if you want. It refers to the 8 presidents between Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, who, in my opinion, are some of the worst men to ever hold the office. And it is truly incredible how terrible and inefficient they all were, and how much they divided the country and led it to what would eventually become the Civil War. These 8 from memory are Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. All terrible presidents in some way or another, some worse than others. But one like common theme you see going through these men is that it slowly became more and more apparent that the country was going to tear itself apart because of the issue of slavery, and they all either actively tried to avoid and not address the issue, or when they did try to address the issue, they only made things worse. So when it comes down to that 8, the standout worst 2 of them, so the worst of the worst were probably Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. And if you don't know, these 2 oversaw a mini civil war that occurred before 1860 in Bleeding, Kansas, when what would become Kansas was literally tearing itself apart over the issue of slavery. People were killing each other in the streets and burning down towns because of how violent things they were getting over the subject of slavery. This incident of Bleeding, Kansas was so extreme, in fact, that there were 2 rival governments set up within the territory, both of whom appealed to become the official government of what would become the state of Kansas. Where Pierce really went wrong with this was that he pushed really hard for the pro-slavery government that had been set up to be legitimized as the real government of Kansas. And even though it had become very clear, and Congress found mass fraud and illegitimacy in that pro-slave government, because people from Missouri who were pro-slavery had come into the territory and voted it in, Pierce decided that he would support this pro-slavery government, and that he would even deploy federal troops against the abolitionist government that had been set up, and deem the whole abolitionist government as a rebellion, which, let's just say, did not really put tensions at ease across the country. And, of course, enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act as hard as he could, Pierce got the entirety of the North to detest him because he was having federal troops go into states like Massachusetts, capturing runaway slaves and sending them back to the South, which just soured the opinion of everyone in the North and just raised tensions even further. So Buchanan follows after Pierce, and I think there's a really interesting point you have to make with these 2, which is that they're both what are known as dough faces in American history, which are Northerners who are extremely sympathetic to the South and supporting the existence and continued existence of slavery. Now, if you know anything about James Buchanan, it's probably either that he's regarded as a terrible president and the guy that came before Lincoln, or you're aware of the rumors that he was allegedly gay in his lifetime. But regardless of if he was or if he wasn't, he had an extended, long relationship in which he lived alone with William Rufus King, who was Pierce's vice president. And the 2 of them had a very close bond. Now, I'm not going to delve into whether or not it was a romantic or just a platonic bond, but I think it's important because it kind of informs James Buchanan's political perspective on things, because he was fascinated with Southern culture and romanticizing it. So William Rufus King was a senator from Alabama before he was vice president, and his close relationship with Buchanan really highlighted to him why the South was so great and so unique in its own way, and that really shaped Buchanan's perspective, because throughout his entire presidency, his assumption of the nation was that the North was being too extreme in what it wanted, and that it was disrespecting and needlessly offending the South, somehow coming to that conclusion with all the evidence in front of him. And it can't be overstated how terrible that perspective was for somebody who was in charge of the nation at such a divisive and such a contentious time. Buchanan also tried to force Kansas to be admitted as a slave state, picking up where Pierce left off. But he did fail when there was heaps of opposition, and this was really, really highlighting the division that existed, was that Northerners in the House absolutely refused to let Kansas be admitted with a slavery or pro-slavery constitution. And that was really the clear dividing line that existed between the North and the South, was that this was the issue that was going to break the country apart. Buchanan also played a role in the Dred Scott decision, which was the Supreme Court decision that declared that African Americans could not and would never be legally citizens of the United States, which Buchanan incorrectly believed would end the partisan division, because in his mind, it was the Northerners always being over the top and overreacting. So he thought a Supreme Court decision that says that African Americans can never be citizens of the United States would put them in their place and shut them up. He even went so far as to trying to persuade one of the justices who he knew personally, please vote in line with this, it will save the country, and just destroy the Republican Party, this new anti-slavery party, and bring the nation together. It did not do that. To put a final nail in the coffin of Buchanan's legacy, as it were, when the states started seceding, and they did start seceding during his term as president after Lincoln had officially been elected, he made possibly one of the worst political decisions ever, which was to go out there and somehow unite the country in that everyone, North and South, thought that his remarks were profoundly terrible. He said that the South had no right to secede, but that the northern states had no right to stop them from seceding, effectively coming out and saying, both sides are wrong, but we can't do anything about it. What are we going to do? And from that point on, he was always regarded as one of the just worst politicians in American history. This is a man who did nothing, or rather, let's look at both of them. These are two men who did effectively everything wrong when the country needed a strong leader, more than at any point in its history, arguably since the time of Washington. And they both completely misunderstood what the country needed and let things get worse and worse until it literally tore itself in half. These two are the worst presidents the country has ever seen, and they're not Donald Trump, they're not Joe Biden. And look, whichever way you lean, these two are profoundly awful men, and I leave it up to you to decide who you hate more.